Hello, and welcome back to Sinclair Schools. Today we're going to talk about the budgeting process for Maine schools. The budgeting process within school districts takes place across calendar years, school years, and fiscal years. In general, one budget is approved in the spring. That budget is for the school year that begins the following fall. During that school year, administrators and staff and communities and school boards work together to develop the budget for the upcoming fiscal year. Fiscal years take place from July 1st until June. Fiscal years are also named after the year in which they end. So, for example, a budget could be adopted in the spring of 2024. That budget would be in place in the fall of 2024 when a school year begins. During the course of that school year, students, staff, facilities, and needs could shift within the existing budget. But it is at that time that the administration and school board is charged with the task of developing the budget that will pass the following spring for the following school year, named after the fiscal year that would end more than a year ahead of that time. During the development process, there are a number of items that are typically unknown. Often, the administrators do not yet know the exact healthcare costs, the exact salaries, the exact state subsidy, the exact student enrollment, and sometimes, particularly if a school district is awaiting a formal audit, it can be difficult to know the exact amount of unassigned fund balance and money that could exist within reserve accounts. Understanding educational funding is in large part about terminology. It's important to understand how educational funding is developed and then how it is expended. In general, municipalities receive funds designated for educational purposes through one of four ways. Revenue can be raised for the general school fund by receiving money from the state in the form of the state subsidy. Towns can receive tuition funds from other towns, usually as a result of students exercising school choice. Local taxpayers raise a certain percentage of funds for public education through the process of taxes known as tax assessment. And finally, grant funding, which includes federal funds, is a process that takes place separate from, but in consideration with, the regular budget cycle. All of those funds, with the exception of grants, are placed into something called an unassigned or undesignated fund. This is the home for any and all monies that have been raised or designated for educational purposes, but have not yet been allocated for expenditures through the voting process. In order for money to be set aside to be spent, it must go through the public voting process. That process typically takes place through warrant articles and town meetings and referendum votes. Those warrant articles raise the money and authorize the expenditure of money through the budget adoption process. Expenditure totals are set aside within 11 cost centers within the expenditure budget, with the specific intent of paying the bills during the budget's fiscal year. At the end of that fiscal year, any unspent budgeted money is returned to the unassigned fund. From the unassigned fund, funds can be set aside in reserve accounts. These are set aside by vote of the voters for longer-term needs and projects, and they can be spent as needed only under established guidelines. They can be spent across fiscal years, unlike all other forms of voted upon expenditure. A little more information on avenues of revenue. The state subsidy is the term for the money that comes from the state of Maine to local municipalities. Maine has committed to funding 55% of the cost of public education across the state. However, it is incredibly important to remember that that 55% is of the total anticipated statewide amount of money needed to educate all students. That amount is calculated in the fall based on the statistics provided by various school districts. And 55% of that total is then generated through the state's annual budget. This money is doled out to municipalities as the state subsidy. This amount varies widely from town to town based on a funding formula involving the essential programs and services formula, as well as the assessment of a town's ability to pay as measured by property value. Key points to remember: yes, the state of Maine is currently paying 55%, but that money is not distributed equally to all municipalities or school districts. Costs for this funding formula are determined by essential programmings and services. Town subsidy amounts are determined using a state form called an ED 279, which can be accessed online. And towns receive widely different amounts of subsidies. Some towns receive subsidies of more than 90% of their expenses, and some receive less than 15%. This distinction is based above all on the property value of the tax base within a community. Around 35% of municipalities are referred to as minimum receivers, meaning that the state deems them able to pay 95% of the cost of education due to their high tax bases. Another form of revenue that many school districts address is tuition. Students in Maine are sometimes offered school choice. This is most common when their hometown does not include a school or does not include a school at the secondary level. The mechanism for funding this is often called tuition, as it requires the sending town to pay the receiving school district directly. Tuition amounts are calculated by the state, and they vary from school to school based on student age and prior budgets. The base tuition amounts are determined in the fall for that year, and special education rates are based on the same annual rate. Tuition can be paid to either a public or accepted private school. Every year, the state sets something called a maximum allowable tuition amount, or MAT, that is based on previous costs. For example, one school district that was receiving tuition in students in the elementary grades might have a state MAT set at $15,974. That same school might be paying for their students to go out of town to receive a secondary education at a cost of $13,312 per student. There is an additional tuition that is received in behalf of students who are receiving special education. If a student's IEP has designated that they receive specially designed instruction for less than 50% of their time, their overall tuition will be the MAT tuition plus an additional 20% of that. If a student spends more than 50% of their time in specially designed instruction, their tuition costs will be the maximum allowable tuition plus an additional 40%. Another source of revenue is called the assessment. The town's governing body, often a city council or a town select board, determines the amount of revenue to be raised to fund all municipal services, which includes education. The required total to fund all of those services is divided by the local assessed tax valuation, and the resulting number is the tax rate or millage rate. The mill rate is the amount of money per $1,000 of property value to be paid by the property owner to the municipality. Mill rates depend on necessary municipal expenditures and the fair market value of the property that makes up the tax base. A couple of points to keep in mind. While the mill rate is the amount owed to the municipality for every $1,000 of property value, that rate will go up with increased municipal expenses, including education, fire, paving, or town office costs. Mill rates go down with an increased property value and an increasing tax base. Here are some example Lincoln County 2025 evaluation totals, demonstrating the wide range of tax base that is considered to be a part of each different municipality. The fourth area of revenue is perhaps the most complicated. Public schools can and do receive a variety of funds that are designed to achieve specific goals. This may be as simple as receiving a grant to develop a school garden, but it is more often found in the complexity known as federal funding. Federal funding for public schools is overseen through the Department of Education, and it is issued to states through two key pieces of federal legislation. One is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. This supplements special education funds with what are referred to as local entitlement funds. The other key piece of legislation is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA, which supplements areas of general education. Please note the use of the word supplement. Federal funds must be used to supplement programs that already exist within school districts. They cannot be used to supplant or take over those funds. ESEA, which used to be referred to as ESSA or NCLB, these are funds that are often called title funds. They're called that because the various sections of the law are referred to as titles. The most common titles that you'll hear discussed in educational funding are Title I funds. These are specifically designed to support disadvantaged students, often from a lower socioeconomic bracket. Title II funds are designed to support and increase effective instruction. Title III funds are designed to support English language learners and therefore vary widely from district to district based on demographics. And Title IV funds are designed to encourage schools to be cutting edge, particularly with their use of technology. School districts have a variety of ways that they can seek to utilize title funds, but one way might be to hire a teacher or a tech integrator, but pay a portion of that salary with title funds. This would be considered supplementing, as some of the school district's own funding would be used for this position, but the title funding would be supplementing that position rather than paying for it whole cloth. Two other important things to remember are that federal funds function on a reimbursement model, which means that the funds must be expended first out of local expenditures and then replenished. School districts typically received what is referred to as a district allocation letter from the Department of Education around June that indicates the amounts for the upcoming year and what portion of that must be shared with other schools that exist within the same community. Turn for a moment to the diagram of general school funding, recognizing that we have now talked about the major sources of revenue and are therefore going to move over to the process by which funds are expended. The first area that we will address is the area in which the budget is designed through the 11 cost centers that appear in the annual warrant articles. These expenditure amounts are set by voters during the local budget process. They are found within 11 different cost centers. Each of these 11 cost centers can often be referred to twice in warrant articles, as the local municipality needs to get voter permission to raise the amount necessary, typically through tax assessments, but must also get second permission to expend those funds. Cost Center 1 is regular education. This includes all general, regular education, pre-K through 12th grade teachers, ed techs, substitute teachers, and salaries and benefits for those. This is also where costs for classroom and instructional supplies would be found, as well as general professional development that would be applicable to most or all staff. Cost Center 2 is special education. This is where any and all local municipal special education teachers and ed techs and their salaries and benefits would take place. This is also where the special services costs from an AOS budget, if a municipality is part of an AOS, would be found. Additionally, classroom and program materials specific to special education would be located within Cost Center 2. Finally, additional programs that are necessary for certain special education situations, such as speech pathology, psychological evaluations, physical and occupational therapy, as well as tuition and fees for students who have been designated for out-of-district services, would be found within Cost Center 2. Cost Center 3 is specific to career and technical education. These are often considered vocational instructional programs that take place within several of the existing high schools around the state of Maine. This is a cost that is specific to secondary level schools and therefore often doesn't appear in schools that are specific to elementary grades. Cost Center 4 is other instruction. This is an area where co-curricular or extracurricular or summer school programs would be found, as well as any athletic programs, coaches, advisors, etc., for organizations and extracurricular opportunities. Cost Center 5 is student and staff support. These are typically for both staff members as well as specific technological needs that are designed to support our students. Guidance counselors, social workers, and nurses and their salaries and benefits would appear in Cost Center 5, as would any necessary devices or software for student testing, as well as broader areas of computer hardware and software. Cost Center 6 is the system administration costs. These are the costs that are associated with the superintendent of schools and the central business office functions. This also involves the costs associated with the administration of the school district, such as legal fees, audit services, and liability insurance. If a town is part of an AOS, this cost center also represents the municipality's portion of the central office costs. Cost Center 7 is school administration, building principal and administrative assistant salary and benefits. This also includes any other needs, technologically speaking, that the front office might require. Cost Center 8 includes transportation and buses. This is typically where items such as salary and benefits for bus drivers, the cost of maintenance and fuel for vehicles is included. Cost Center 9 is facilities and maintenance. This is typically where we will find custodial staff salaries and benefits, items necessary for cleaning and repairs for the buildings, as well as minor and short-term buildings and grounds projects. Cost Center 10 is debt service. Debt service is the line that is specific to the repayment of loans, typically due to borrowing for major capital improvements, such as the purchase of new buses or significant building construction. And finally, we have Cost Center 11. Cost Center 11 is the miscellaneous other expenditures category. Most typically, this is the place where all costs of school nutrition will be found, as well as any and all costs associated with outside organizations using any of the areas available for the school. One additional area of expenditure to consider are those things called reserve accounts. During the budget adoption process, sometimes a school will ask the community to consider setting funds aside in reserve accounts. Those funds are designated by the voters to be spent on specific needs that do not necessarily appear within the regular budget cost centers. Reserve accounts have a couple of major advantages, one of which is that they maintain their balance of funds across fiscal years, so they can be used either to build up resources for a larger project or to fund a project that might need to take place over the summer, such as paving a driveway. Reserve accounts can also be used to prevent significant shifts in budgets from year to year. Here are two examples. Capital reserve accounts are one of the most common reserve accounts. A capital reserve account is often used to build up and maintain financial capital needed for large construction projects such as building improvements, paging, or bus purchases. Often, a small amount will be moved into this account every year to build up to the amount needed. Reserve accounts are created with specified limits on use. So if a town's voters were willing to create a capital reserve account, it would often be created with wording something as this account is designed to build up funds for the future purchase of a school bus. A second example of a common reserve account is something called a student expense reserve account. Student expense reserve accounts are a way to set aside funds that could be required for a new student or a shift in student population. In order to budget to actual predicted expenditures, budgets are created based on anticipated student population and need. Were a high-need student to enter the district or an existing student to require an out-of-district placement, that cost could be a huge and sudden unanticipated burden on taxpayers. By setting aside funds in reserve accounts, sometimes those specific high-need moments can be spread across multiple years rather than seeing a significant shift in taxes from year to year. There are three major data points that are typically tracked when it comes to educational funding. One of those is simple expenditures. This is the cost of the school. One way to consider expenditures is to consider them by fiscal year, looking at how those totals are shifting over time. But keep in mind that assessment is not the same as expenditures. The assessment created by a town is the cost to the taxpayers. This is essentially the expenditures minus whatever forms of revenue are being received through subsidies, grants, tuition. The assessment is the burden that is being placed on the local taxpayers to be raised through property tax. The third and final data point that many citizens take into consideration is the percentage of town taxes that are being spent on education. That percentage varies wildly from town to town and is often a way of recognizing the distinction from year to year in what is happening within the educational funding of a town and the other municipal funding. Finally, it is important to remember that all of this school budgeting is adopted during a budget voting process. School budgets and school funds are separate from and yet a part of municipal budgeting. State statute requires that school budgets be announced, discussed, and adopted in an open town hall style meeting. However, state statute also encourages municipalities to include a second vote to verify that determined budget. This second validation vote should occur by referendum or paper ballot voting. If a town chooses to institute a budget validation referendum, that budget validation referendum will be in place for 3 years, at which time it can be reconsidered. So we sort of have a choose your own adventure process. The school budget will always be developed and adopted by school administrators and the school board. That school budget will then be communicated to town officials and voters. That school budget will be discussed and adopted in an open town meeting style. And then one of two things can happen. If a town and its voters have chosen to stick with a one-step process, once the school budget is adopted in the open town meeting, that school budget is final. Or voters could require that the school budget appear on a second step, a written referendum for a second validation vote. At the end of that process, the school budget would be considered finalized. I recognize that this doesn't begin to answer all of your questions, but my hope is that it allows some of the voters out there who are trying to learn about this process to understand a little bit better some of the terminology and processes by which school budgeting occurs. Thank you.